You have done obviously a great job in franchising. You are an emerging brand, but you're not new to franchising. You know, Aaron, you've done a tremendous job in another aspect that a lot of founders have not put enough value in, and that is in personal branding. Because I see you everywhere, right? You speak at Springboard, you spoke at Emerging Franchisor Conference, you're all over LinkedIn, you're on a bunch of podcasts. I think you've done a great job and really a service, not just to Rolling Suds, but for yourself and how you expand your brand. And I look back at your history and I'm like, all right, we got a Hollywood guy here. So maybe that's the genesis of it. So I want the audience to learn more about you.
Okay.
So let's go back before franchising. So what led you, what were you doing before you got into franchising? And I want to hear a little bit more about this Hollywood background.
Yeah, sure. So have you ever seen the show Entourage?
Yeah.
So I thought I wanted to be Ari Gold, except maybe just a little bit more measured in the film and television industry. I thought I wanted to be a talent agent.
Right.
So I went to film school. I grew up in Southern California, and I went to film school at UC Santa Barbara. And I graduated, and I went straight down to Hollywood to work in the mailroom of a talent agency. In Hollywood, like no matter whether you want to be a producer or an agent or a director, like you start at a talent agency because nothing can happen without the talent agency. That's where you meet all the people. I did that and kind of rose up the ranks pretty quickly and was on track to be kind of an agent. And it takes between 5 to 7 years or so of like training to become an agent. And not everyone makes it. I worked for partners. What I learned is that the only people who are more high maintenance, let's just say, than the actors is the agents and managers that represent them.
Okay.
And so my job my job was managing basically like I was the liaison between the agents and the actors. Like I was effectively the manager of their business.
Okay.
And that's how you learn kind of like how deals work and all that kind of stuff. And about 5 years in, I was like, wait a minute, I don't want to be anything like any of the people I'm working for.
Okay.
And so, if I'm working every single day, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, and I don't want what person I'm working for has, I really need to think about what I'm doing. And so I switched and I got into music. I liked music more. I was on the kind of management side of a record label, helping to build a division in music, but still working around like creatives. And I really love working like with creative people. I believe that like I can bring out more creativity from people by just that's kind of like a skill set I feel like I have. But there was no long term track for me there unless I like hit it big with like the next actor or writer or in that case musician. And I started calling around different people and a buddy of mine worked in franchising. He's like, you need to be making more money. And I'm like, I'm listening. And he's like, you should get into franchise development. And I thought what a lot of the other people think that are outside franchising is like, what do you mean? Like, right. It goes, what, McDonald's? Like, what do you mean? And he told me that like, no, he works for an established carpet cleaning concept, but people can basically buy a business for under $250,000 and be an entrepreneur or be a business owner. That was really interesting to me. Now, his boss didn't have any job openings, but he made the mistake of giving me his email. And I emailed his boss every 3 weeks for 6 months until he hired me. And so that was kind of the genesis of it. So on the franchise masters thing I was on, I jumped from Hollywood to carpet cleaning.
Of course. Why not? Look, everybody else jumps from something that has nothing to do with franchising into franchising.
Right.
So you go into Chem-Dry. Now, Chem-Dry is a well-established franchisor, and you're part of, I imagine, a team of franchise development people, right? So you're selling franchises among, how big is probably the team then? They have like 4 or 5 people then?
At the time, they had 3 different franchise developers.
Okay.
I believe I was the 4th and then one left. So they teetered anywhere from 2 to 4 franchise directors per year.
Right. Okay, so this is like 2017. So what do you think when you get into franchising? You know nothing about selling franchises.
So it took a really long time. Like anyone who starts in franchise development, like it takes a long time to start like figuring things out. And like it's a different kind of sale, I would say. Like there's a recruiting element, there's consulting, there's all these pieces that are kind of like hard to put a finger on. The benefit that I had is I went from an industry where like every single person was like hard to please, like almost impossible to please to like this part where I get to provide this opportunity where someone could start a business, but had to really figure out the nuance of that. There were these very like structured ways to do things. And so that's what I was taught. Like you do this, you get them to a webinar, you do the webinar, you go to this, you go to this step, you go to this step. And it was a great learning experience. But what I learned over the years is that the process that you do for franchise development needs to be unique to the buyer, even though there's stuff that you do every single time. Like it needs to adapt to the type of buyer that you're talking
Hmm.
to make that more of a meaningful experience. And that was very like the process there was very cookie cutter. It was very like if they have this amount of capital, when you get them to this stage, they can kind of sign up and it was fine. There were a lot of things I thought that should have been different, honestly, but it's a 40-year-old brand. And so who am I? I just came from Hollywood. Like, I don't know what franchising is.
Right.
But yeah, so I learned a lot. And then I jumped from that to an emerging brand after that.
Hmm.
So
So I love that you started in franchise development because that's the heart of the matter. Of course, we know that unit economics is most important, but if you're going to start in franchising, to hear personally what buyers are saying, what are they questioning, what are their fears, what are their hopes and dreams, what is the franchise itself, what the franchise offering is, and what does the franchise agreement look like. To start in franchising and franchise development, I think gave you a huge advantage.
absolutely. I know every single call I have with a buyer, I know exactly what they need. And so
Hmm.
to be able to reverse engineer from there and say, okay, I'm going to build a brand. I know exactly what franchisees need and what their concerns are because I meet them when they're not a business owner.
Right.
And I've seen the life cycle of like franchisees that have been in a year, 2 years, 3 years, how their business grows. And so to build that, to be able to build it from that point into being an emerging franchisor is definitely does give me a leg up, I believe.
Yeah. So, okay. So then you go to the Belfour Franchise Group. Who are they? I'm not familiar with the name.
So Belfour Corporate is the biggest restoration company in the world. So
Okay.
they do like large scale disaster relief. They rebuilt the Notre Dame Cathedral in France. They cleaned the Princess cruise ship for COVID. So like they restore like stadiums. They'll rebuild cities after hurricanes and tornadoes hit. So they had a franchise division called Belfour Franchise Group, and they had three brands at the time. So a water damage brand, a duct cleaning brand, and a commercial hood cleaning brand.
Okay.
They wanted to build to a multi-brand like platform company. So they bought us and they put us in charge of their franchise division. So my leadership team stepped in and then they said they wanted to scale. And so my boss, the COO of the company, found a brand called Patch Boys, which they acquired from an emerging franchisor. They bought the business in COVID in June of 2020, and it was an emerging franchise brand
Hmm.
that was about 4 years old, and it had 100 units sold, 40 franchisees. The founder exited, and my boss asked me if I would come in and help run the brand and do franchise development, but also kind of help influence the infrastructure of the brand. And so that was kind of the switch from Chem-Dry over to the Patch Boys, which is a drywall repair concept.
This
We
is
were
a
first
huge
to,
this is a huge step up for you personally.
yeah,
Going from franchise development now to being involved in, a leadership position in growing a brand.
it was a big step up. I went from franchise director to like senior franchise development director, but really I wore a lot of hats because I was effectively the first full-time employee
Hmm.
on that business because there was no management team in place. There wasn't really any systems. And so me and the brand president were basically the first full-time employees. We had to walk back a lot of kind of like improper expectations that were set by the founder and really essentially build a franchise system. We needed to do a rebrand or like a brand refresh. There was no item 19, there was no software, there was no lead gen structure in place. Like it was all essentially we built it from scratch. Well, negative scratch because we had
Right.
we had to work backwards. It was a tremendous experience. And what I learned from that, I mean, I learned a ton, but what I learned from that is the brand president and me, which was getting the brand ready to sell, and the brand president, like we were talking every day, like 4, 5, 6 times a day, because him and I, like, and so we developed this like incredible amount of trust with each other. And he knew that I cared deeply about the success of the franchisees that were existing, but also the ones we brought in. And I knew that he was working tirelessly to make sure that systems were being built for franchisees.
Nice.
And so what you find in the franchising industry is there's this disconnect between operations and sales. And what ends up happening, and sometimes it's like by design, because you have a franchise sales organization that is literally not part of the operations team at all. What I learned is basically if sales and operations don't talk to each other and they're not aligned on what needs to happen to grow the franchise, then franchisees suffer. Those two different departments have to adapt to the changes of the brand.
Right. Right. And that's why
and they can't adapt unless they're talking.
Sure. And that's why if you're a franchisor that's using an outside franchise sales organization, it takes even a more concerted effort of the leadership team of the franchise organization to making sure that that FSO is integrated as much with the culture and with operations as possible. If there's a disconnect there, they're just selling franchises away and operations just feels like they're the recipient of these franchisees.
Correct. And they have to kind of essentially clean up the mess of franchise development. So I talk a lot about responsible franchising, and like it truly begins in the franchise development process and setting the proper expectations. And like with Rolling Suds, we've now turned away 33 people in the franchise development process that weren't right, which we do 2 to 3 territories per buyer. So that's potentially 100 units that we turn down. But it's because I'm all about putting the right people in the right seats. I know who's going to be successful in my system and I know who's not.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fumey, or Emerging Franchise Group LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.